Kaydee keeps following Shadow, but now another eagle could change everything. For weeks, the story in Big Bear has seemed to move in only one direction. Kaydee keeps coming back. She returns to the familiar trees. She checks the nest. She spends time near the places Shadow uses most often. She calls. He answers. Sometimes they remain near one another for long periods. And little by little, an eagle that once looked like a temporary visitor has become one of the most closely watched animals in the valley. But there is still one test we have not really seen. And it may be the test that tells us more about Shadow than every quiet perch, nest visit, and vocal exchange combined. What happens when another eagle enters the picture? Because until now, most of the attention has been focused on what Shadow does when Kaydee approaches him. He has not consistently driven her away. He has shared space with her. He has responded to her calls. At times, he has even moved into the same trees where she was already perched. Those observations are fascinating, but they are happening under relatively calm conditions. Kaydee approaches. Shadow reacts, and the encounter continues. A real territorial challenge could change everything. Not because another eagle would automatically become a rival for Kaydee, and not because Shadow would necessarily defend her in the way humans might imagine, but because the arrival of a third eagle could reveal something we have not yet been able to measure clearly. How important has Kaydee's presence become to Shadow? And if another eagle suddenly challenged the space they have been sharing, would Shadow's behavior look different? That may be the next mystery in Big Bear. To understand why, we need to look at how much has already changed. When Kaydee first appeared, she was simply an unfamiliar young bald eagle. She had a recognizable identity because of her leg band. But biologically, she was still a visitor entering an established eagle territory. That distinction matters. Shadow has occupied Big Bear for years. He knows the lake, the nesting territory, the familiar lookout trees, the roosting areas, the routes between them. Kaydee did not, at least not at first. Yet instead of making one brief appearance and disappearing, she returned. Then returned again, and over time her movements seemed to become increasingly connected to the places Shadow already used. The nest, the twin pines, the roost, the lookout areas. At first, everyone asked the obvious question: why does Kaydee keep following Shadow? But the more we watch, the more complicated that question becomes. Because perhaps Kaydee is not simply following an eagle. Perhaps she is learning a territory, and perhaps Shadow is no longer simply tolerating a stranger. Perhaps he is becoming familiar with her too. Those are still possibilities, not conclusions. But repeated observations are beginning to give us something more useful than one dramatic moment, a pattern. And patterns matter because they create expectations. When Kaydee appears now, many viewers no longer immediately expect Shadow to chase her. That alone is a remarkable change from the beginning. The presence of Kaydee has become less surprising. She has become familiar, but familiarity is easiest to maintain when nothing interrupts it. Another eagle could be that interruption. Bald eagle territories are not empty spaces. They exist within larger landscapes where other eagles travel. Young birds wander, subadults explore. Adults move through neighboring areas. At times, unfamiliar eagles can appear near established nests or feeding areas. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes one bird leaves quickly. Sometimes resident eagles respond aggressively. And sometimes encounters escalate into territorial conflict. That is why the possibility of another eagle entering Big Bear is so interesting now. It would introduce a new variable into a story that has so far been built mainly around two individuals, Kaydee and Shadow. Imagine a third eagle appearing near one of the familiar trees. Would Kaydee remain? Would she leave? Would Shadow react? Would he respond differently depending on where the eagle appeared? Near the lake, near Kaydee, near the nest? Those details would matter enormously, because an eagle's response to a visitor can tell us something about what part of the territory it values. And perhaps, indirectly, about which relationships inside that territory have become important. But we need to be extremely careful here. If Shadow chased another eagle, that would not automatically prove he was protecting Kaydee. Territorial defense can occur for many reasons. The nest itself could be the important resource. The perch could matter. The intruder could simply be too close. Shadow could be responding to another eagle because that eagle entered his territory. Regardless of where Kaydee was, that distinction is critical. The goal is not to turn every territorial interaction into a romance story. The goal is to ask whether Shadow's behavior changes depending on context. That is where the real clue may eventually appear. Suppose another eagle lands far from the nest and Shadow ignores it. Then later, a different eagle lands beside Kaydee and Shadow immediately moves closer. Would that prove pair bonding? No, but it would create a much more interesting pattern. Or suppose another eagle approaches the nest while Kaydee is already there. Would Shadow defend the nest? Would Kaydee leave? Would both eagles react? Would one remain while the other takes the lead? Again, one encounter would not answer everything, but it could give us a new type of evidence. Until now, most of the evidence has come from proximity. What happens when Shadow and Kaydee are together? The next phase may come from competition. What happens when someone else arrives? And this is where Kaydee's repeated visits become even more important. If she were still an occasional visitor, the arrival of another eagle would probably tell us very little about her relationship with Shadow. But Kaydee has already established a pattern of returning. She has visited the nest. She has spent time around familiar trees. She has been present near Shadow repeatedly. She has participated in vocal exchanges. And she appears increasingly comfortable navigating the territory. That means a third eagle would not be entering a completely empty relationship. It would be entering a situation that already has history. Not necessarily pair history, but interaction history. Shadow recognizes Kaydee. Kaydee recognizes Shadow. They have encountered one another enough times that neither is completely unknown to the other. That changes the context. And context is everything in wildlife behavior. Think about the difference between two situations. In the first, Shadow is alone. An unfamiliar eagle arrives. Shadow reacts. Whatever happens can be interpreted mainly as territorial behavior. Now consider a second situation. Kaydee is already nearby. She and Shadow have been sharing space. A third eagle approaches. Suddenly there are more questions. Does Kaydee respond first? Does one eagle move toward the other before confronting the newcomer? Does the third eagle approach the nest? Does it approach Kaydee? Does Shadow's reaction become more intense when Kaydee is present? These are not questions we can answer in advance, but they show why a third eagle could reveal more than another peaceful Kaydee visit. Peace tells us they can occupy the same space. Competition might reveal how that shared space is organized, and perhaps whether Kaydee is beginning to occupy a special place within it. There is also something else we have to remember. Kaydee herself is not powerless in this story. It would be easy to frame everything as Shadow, deciding whether Kaydee belongs. But Kaydee is also making choices. She can leave, she can return, she can approach, she can investigate the nest, she can move towards Shadow, she can react to other eagles. So if a new eagle appears, Kaydee's behavior may become just as revealing as Shadow's. Would she retreat immediately? Would she remain near the nest? Would she vocalize? Would she move closer to Shadow? Would she confront the newcomer independently? Those behaviors could tell us whether Big Bear has become more than a place she casually explores, because defending space is very different from visiting it. Again, one territorial reaction would not prove ownership, but repeated participation in territorial behavior would be something worth watching closely. That is why the possibility of another eagle is so important. It could test both sides of the story at once. Shadow's tolerance of Kaydee, and Kaydee's commitment to Big Bear. So far, Kaydee's story has been mostly about approach. She approaches the territory. She approaches the nest. She approaches Shadow. She returns to familiar trees. The direction is inward, closer, more familiar, more repeated. But another eagle could force the story in the opposite direction. Instead of asking how close Kaydee can come, we may have to ask, what happens when someone tries to push her away? That is a much stronger test. Because comfort is easy to observe when there is no pressure. Behavior under pressure can reveal priorities, and this is something wildlife observers understand very well. Animals do not always show the importance of a resource when conditions are calm. Sometimes you only learn what matters when the resource is threatened: a nest, a feeding area, a territory, a mate, a familiar social partner. The challenge is determining which of those things actually triggered the response. And that is where patience becomes essential. Let's imagine several possible outcomes. The first is simple. Another eagle arrives, Shadow reacts strongly. Kaydee leaves. The newcomer leaves. Nothing else happens. That would probably tell us mainly that Shadow remains territorial. Interesting, but not enough to say much about Kaydee. A second possibility. Another eagle appears near Kaydee. Shadow approaches rapidly and the newcomer leaves. Kaydee remains. That would be more interesting, but still not proof that Shadow acted specifically for Kaydee. A third possibility. Kaydee and Shadow both react to the newcomer. Perhaps they vocalize. Perhaps both remain close to the nest. Perhaps the visitor leaves while Kaydee and Shadow stay. Now we would have a potentially more meaningful interaction. Not because it automatically confirms partnership, but because coordinated behavior would be new evidence. And if similar behavior happened repeatedly, the pattern would become much harder to dismiss. This is how wildlife interpretation should work. Not from one dramatic event, from repetition, context, comparison, and perhaps the biggest clue would be what happens afterward. Suppose another eagle leaves. Do Shadow and Kaydee remain together? Do they return to the nest? Do they vocalize? Does Kaydee disappear for hours afterward? Does Shadow follow her? The aftermath can sometimes tell us more than the confrontation itself. A burst of aggression is easy to notice, but what animals choose to do once the threat disappears may reveal more about their relationship. And this is where the current Kaydee story gives us something useful. We already have a baseline. We know how Shadow behaves around Kaydee under calm conditions. He often tolerates her. He sometimes shares space. He has participated in vocal exchanges. He has allowed the story to continue without a consistent pattern of prolonged rejection. So if his behavior under competitive conditions suddenly looked different, we would have something to compare. That comparison may become the most valuable evidence of all. There is another reason this matters now. Kaydee is approaching adulthood. Her appearance has become increasingly mature. Her head is largely white, though a small amount of darker feathering may still remain. She is old enough that questions about future territory and breeding behavior are no longer abstract. They are becoming biologically relevant. That does not mean she is ready to form a permanent pair tomorrow, but it means the next phase of her life could involve decisions very different from those of a younger wandering eagle. And Big Bear already offers something valuable: an established territory, a large lake, food, trees, a nest, and Shadow. That combination could attract attention from more than one eagle. Kaydee may not be the last unfamiliar bald eagle to appear here. That possibility is what could transform the current quiet story into something much more complicated for viewers. There is also an emotional temptation. Many have watched Shadow for years. After Jackie's death, every interaction involving another eagle can feel enormous. Kaydee's arrival came at a time when the Big Bear story was already emotionally intense. That makes it easy to see any third eagle as a rival. But nature does not necessarily organize itself into the categories we use. A visiting eagle is not automatically romantic competition. It may simply be exploring, it may be moving through, it may be interested in food, it may be interested in the nest, it may be challenging territory. We have to let behavior define the story, not the label. That is why, if another eagle appears, the most important thing will not be calling it a rival. The important thing will be watching what happens. Who moves first? Who stays? Who leaves? Who calls? Who approaches whom? Those are the observations that matter. And perhaps Shadow's reaction could finally answer a question we have been asking for weeks. How important is Kaydee to him? So far, we know that he has not consistently rejected her. We know he has remained around her. We know the two have shared space, but tolerance is not the same as attachment. A territorial challenge could begin separating those possibilities. If Shadow behaves no differently with Kaydee present than he would when alone, that would suggest caution in interpreting their relationship. If his behavior changes significantly when another eagle approaches Kaydee or the nest, that could become much more interesting. But even then, one event would not be enough. We would need repeated behavior. That word keeps returning for a reason. Repeated. Because repetition is what transforms coincidence into pattern. And pattern is what gives observation scientific value. There is another possibility that could completely surprise viewers. What if Kaydee herself reacts more strongly than Shadow? Imagine another eagle approaching the nest. Shadow remains nearby, but Kaydee is the one who vocalizes, the one who moves closer, the one who stays. That would immediately change the way we think about her relationship with the territory. Until now, Kaydee has been the visitor. But territory is partly defined by behavior. If an animal begins acting as though a place matters enough to defend, that is very different from simply inspecting it. Again, we would need more than one moment, but it could be the beginning of a new question. Is Kaydee no longer simply visiting Big Bear? Is she beginning to behave like she belongs there? And suddenly, the rival story would become less about Shadow defending Kaydee and more about Kaydee defending a place she has chosen. That may ultimately be even more interesting. This is why another eagle could change everything. Not because of drama, not because viewers need a conflict, but because it would give us a new type of information. So far, the Kaydee and Shadow story has been built through peaceful observations. Returns, perches, calls, nest visits, roosting, quiet proximity. Those behaviors tell us the two eagles can share space. A third eagle could tell us what happens when that shared space is challenged. And that may reveal the next stage of the relationship more clearly than anything we have seen so far. But what if nothing happens? That possibility matters too. Suppose another eagle arrives and Shadow barely reacts, Kaydee barely reacts, the visitor spends time nearby, and eventually leaves. That would be important evidence. It would remind us that not every eagle interaction is territorial. It would also warn us against over-interpreting every newcomer as a threat. Science progresses not only when expectations are confirmed. Sometimes the most useful result is realizing the dramatic prediction was wrong. If Shadow remains calm, that tells us something. If Kaydee leaves, that tells us something. If the visitor becomes another recurring presence, the story becomes more complex again. Whatever happens, the goal should remain the same. Watch first, interpret second. And that is perhaps the biggest lesson Kaydee has already taught us. At every stage, the story has looked simple at first. A young eagle arrives. Then she returns. Simple explanation becomes more complicated. She enters the nest. Another question, she spends time with Shadow. Another question, they vocalize. Another question, every answer opens something larger. That is how real wildlife stories develop. Not in a straight line, but through observations that continually force us to revise what we thought we understood. A third eagle could become the next revision. For now, Kaydee and Shadow remain the central characters. Kaydee keeps returning, Shadow keeps appearing around her. Their interactions remain calm enough that viewers can study subtle details rather than only dramatic conflict. And perhaps that quiet period is exactly what we need, because it gives us a baseline. It shows us what normal now looks like. Kaydee nearby, Shadow nearby, shared space, familiarity. That baseline may become incredibly valuable if something suddenly changes. If another eagle arrives and Shadow behaves differently, we will notice. If Kaydee behaves differently, we will notice. If they react together, we will notice. And if neither reacts at all, that may be just as revealing. The question is no longer simply whether Kaydee likes being near Shadow. That question may be too narrow. The bigger question is whether the two eagles are beginning to function within the same territory in a way that could eventually become more organized. That remains unproven. But if it is happening, competition may reveal it. because one of the strongest signs of shared investment in a territory is how animals respond when that territory is challenged. Not what they do during peaceful afternoons, what they do when another eagle arrives. So the next time a visitor appears in Big Bear, watch carefully. Do not immediately call it a rival. Do not immediately assume Shadow is protecting Kaydee. Do not assume Kaydee is defending Shadow's nest. Instead, watch the sequence. Where does the eagle land? Where is Kaydee? Where is Shadow? Who calls first? Who approaches? Who leaves? Does the same pattern happen again? Those small details could answer questions that weeks of peaceful footage have left open. Because Kaydee has already shown us that she wants to keep returning. Shadow has already shown us that her presence does not automatically trigger prolonged rejection. What neither eagle has shown us clearly is what happens when something else enters the equation. And perhaps that is the test this story has been waiting for. A stranger became a visitor. The visitor became familiar. The familiar eagle began sharing trees, nest space, calls, and territory with Shadow. But familiarity is only one stage. The next stage may require pressure. And pressure often comes from competition. If another eagle appears, we may finally see whether Kaydee is simply one tolerated visitor among many, or whether something about her position in Shadow's world has quietly become different. For now, we do not know. That uncertainty is exactly what makes the next encounter worth watching, because the most revealing moment may not be the next time Kaydee flies towards Shadow. It may be the moment another eagle does, and when that happens, don't only watch the newcomer. Watch Kaydee, watch Shadow, and most importantly, watch what they do together, because another eagle may not simply enter the story. It may reveal what the story has been becoming all along.